Hello and welcome to the Art of We podcast. We're recording in the week before the American presidential election, so we are feeling the ambient vibes and thought we would record an episode to speak to that. You're probably hearing this after the election, but if what I think is going to happen, you may not know the result of the election yet.
And specifically the ambient vibes on relationship. Like we've heard so many kind of horror stories and challenging stories about how these kinds of conversations, such as a political, highly charged conversation, is having an impact on relationships, especially in the United States right now. Friendships, partnerships, family, the whole gamut.
And it seems like to me that there are a lot of people out there right now who are digging in their heels inside of this very polarized environment, getting more and more, you could say, radicalized, whether they're going left or going right, either way. And I think that it's harder to have those conversations inside of an environment where I think a lot of what is happening, and I'm not a huge fan of like blaming the media. Like I don't love that kind of meme of like, oh, it's the media. But I think in this case, there's so much polarizing going on in the media and people are getting influenced by that. And they're getting very positional, as you said. So that's where it's an interesting question. I think I just want to offer this to you, listener out there, to ask yourself, am I in this conversation because I want to influence my uncle, my friend, my partner, my child, whoever it is? Is it really important to me that I'm able to influence this person?
And there's going to be some people that say, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know?
And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, one of the ways that I challenged myself during this period is to go out and see if I could influence people who have a very different point of view from mine.
Right. I think another perspective here from an Art of We perspective, especially with the people that we love and we deeply care about, entering into a conversation about what are we up to together and actually trying to find out in advance. And you probably know these people pretty well, which is the other thing. Like, you probably already know the answer to this, but finding out in advance, like, are we having a we conversation here? Are we actually having a conversation here? Or is this about, like you were saying, trying to convince each other to go in a different direction?
Right.
And those are two very different conversations to have.
I agree. I totally agree. And I think one of the things you and I stand for is trying as best we can to raise the level of awareness about what are we actually doing? You know, why am I in this conversation? With one of my friends who's a very dogmatic person in this particular area, in the area of politics, I found myself very frustrated in the conversations partly because I was unaware that I was so committed to trying to influence him about his position. I didn't have an agreement with him ahead of time that that's what we were up to together, to be open-minded enough to be influenced by each other. That wasn't what was going on in the conversation.
Right. And by the time this episode airs, at least in terms of the American election, it'll be too late to go into conversations, be like, okay, like we want to influence each other. That's exactly what we're up to here. Because at least in terms of the ballot itself, the ballots are already submitted. However, there's still tension going on inside of relationships. For example, I follow Katie Couric in her newsletter, and she's recently been talking about how there are a significant amount of women who are hiding what their vote is on the ballot from their husbands. And I'm just like, my brain is blowing up to be like, oh my God, I can't imagine having to be inside of a partnership where I'm hiding who I'm voting for. I'm imagining they're hiding it for pretty good reasons, including avoiding conflict, potential massive rupture, even maybe divorce, who knows. So the ballot has already been, cast, voted, but the continued tension inside of these partnerships, I imagine, will continue on for quite a while.
Right. And part of my diagnosis of the media in throughout the election cycle, since a year ago even, is that there's a lot of appeal to the fight or flight part of the brain in the consumer. And I can feel that in myself when I read articles or watch videos or hear about something that sounds really scary about what so-and-so might do. It's like a minefield to be in the media. And what feels really tragic to me, and I think this is just something that I'm working with, and I don't know if other people can relate to this, is that so many of the conversations I'm having are about partial information from consuming very biased media. One person maybe on the left, maybe one on the right. And the proper, as I would think about it, the proper debate of conservative values versus progressive values is really, really hard to have inside of this heavy layer of polarization that's happening on top of it. There's been a few podcasts that I've been able to find that are actually digging into these deeper philosophical tensions inside of democracy that I think are so beautiful and unresolvable. But it's so hard to find that right now because everybody's being jerked around in their emotions by, oh, so-and-so did this and so-and-so did that, and Republicans are evil and the Democrats are evil and everybody's evil. And, it's so intense.
It's really intense, and it's creating a collective nervous system that we are all feeling, at least in America, if not beyond, because in some ways there's a lot of things that are going to be impacted by this election. But this collective nervous system, that's exactly basically what you're saying about how the media is whipping everything around. There's partial information. It's just all confusing. There's lots of emotion. There's lots of fear. That's all going into a collective nervous system. We're all feeling it in one way or another, whether or not we're being challenged in these conversations relationally with each other.
100%. So we've covered the challenge of coming with an agenda to influence another person. If we're not coming with an agenda to influence them, and we're not simply just there to be a kind of a blank mirror to listen and reflect, what are we doing in these conversations?
Yeah, it reminds me of the big women's rights movement back in, I think it was the 1980s, where there was a lot of disruption about abortion clinics.
The rise of the pro-life movement and violence on abortion doctors. And
yes.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Yes. And there's a documentary out there that we saw where the documentary was all about the women who were leading the two opposite camps. Like there was
pro-choice
and pro-life. Thank you. There was a handful of women in each, and they were originally in the media going at each other. Like what the public didn't know is that at some point, those women on both sides decided to secretly get together. They got together underground. They decided they would do it for a handful of times. They agreed to that to try to figure out why they were so different, why they were in such different camps. And they ended up meeting for many, many, many months together secretly. They didn't want anybody to find out that they were meeting because they were actually making progress in understanding each other's worlds, not to change each other's opinions and stances, but to understand and to be more empathetic about why these women were so vastly opposite. And so when you ask that question, what comes up for me is what we're here to do is to listen really generously to each other, which is one of our relationship agreements, which means that we go into a conversation, consciously choose to peel away our filters, our opinions, our perspectives, all the things that get in the way of us actually deeply listening to somebody and bring empathy and understanding to their worldview. It's almost like I have an image of a whiteboard where it's covered with all of our thoughts about this particular issue, and we just wipe it all off, and we get to understand and bring questions to the person across from us. It's not that we set aside what we stand for. It's not that we're letting that go. But like you said, we're not trying to change each other. We're trying to understand. And I think the understanding is where a lot of movement can happen.
That was a really powerful documentary. Well, we should link to it in the show notes because others might who haven't seen it. It's highly, highly recommended. Really powerful.
And it's not asking the watcher to be pro-life or pro-choice either. It's not about trying to convince the person who's watching the film. It's all about how two opposite sides came to doing something different, radically different.
Good example.
We hope you're enjoying this episode. I want to take a quick break to let you know about a gift we created for you and your partner. We compiled our top 10 relationship agreements that have been so powerful in supporting the success of our partnership that we even turned them into our wedding vows. These agreements help us stay connected, growing, and thriving as a couple, and they've been critical to help us create a kind of we that's way beyond what we've ever experienced before. You can download this free gift at KristaVanderveer.com. That's KristaVanderveer.com. Also, if you enjoy our podcast, it would be so meaningful to us if you left us a rating and review. Not only does it help others find us, but it gives us critical feedback on how we're doing. Thanks in advance, and now back to the episode.
That helps me think about the way that I've been approaching the issues with my friends who have different points of view, or my undecided friends. I've been bringing a lot of agenda of convincing and showing, and what about this article, and what about this podcast, and what about this interview? So yeah, I haven't been practicing a lot of curiosity, if I'm really honest about how I approach those conversations. I've been approaching it with more urgency about converting someone to the vote that I want them to have.
It reminds me back in the days of COVID when there were some conspiracy theorists, and I wasn't in the camp of thinking that there was a lot of conspiracy going on. And I encountered somebody that I love dearly who let me into her world a little bit. And she let me understand, because we built safety and trust inside of the container of the conversation. She let me understand her greatest thoughts and fears about conspiracy. And it was such a different perspective than mine, that if we had not opened the door a little bit to create some safety and security to talk about it versus argue about it, then we wouldn't have gotten anywhere inside of that conversation. And honestly, it was a challenging conversation to be in. I had to really practice wiping my whiteboard clean to to center myself and stay in the conversation without listening to argue, listening to prove my point, listening to be right about something or convince her about something. But to your point, when somebody's coming to me with a conversation, political or otherwise, that's kind of heated, if they're coming with this more positional, this is XYZ, this is the way things are, this is how it is, like a very strong position, it's really hard for me to be in that conversation. So if we think about relationally, if we're wanting to bring in some flexibility, some understanding, are we in our own selves using words that can create a little bit of defensiveness in our partner or in our friend? What is the language that we're using, and are we being responsible for that?
I think the key element here that you're talking about is curiosity. I think it's pretty easy for most people, at least people listening to this show, to answer the question to themselves: am I feeling genuinely curious about this person's point of view and how they arrived at it and what they've been feeling and thinking and doing around it? Are you genuinely curious, or are you coming with this agenda to flip someone, or to prove a point, or be right, like you said? A feeling of curiosity, I think it's important to know how you as an individual feel that in your body and your mind. Like, what does it actually feel like? So you can recognize that state and obviously know what it feels like when you're not in that state.
Totally. And this is like mastering relationship in a certain way. If you think about all of the ruptures that you and I have, all the different ways that our parts can come in super strong about different things. If one of us doesn't have the capacity to invite something other than righteousness or defensiveness or agended conversation, we're not going to get very far in finding mutuality and finding alignment and at least understanding each other's perspectives, even if we're not trying to change it. So while I don't feel like we have the answer to solve political unrest in relationships, in friendships, partnerships, families, I feel like there is a practice of how do we want to show up?
Right. How do we want our loved ones to feel when we interact with them? Do we want to listen generously? Do we want to impact them with the care and love that comes with curiosity without agenda? Versus, do we want them to feel like they're on the ropes and they're getting pummeled by a bully or a person who thinks that they know better. No more. I can take responsibility for often feeling that way in this political climate, that I'm the one who's done, the hours of research every day for the last year to inform myself. And therefore I'm the one with the answer that you should subscribe to.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that anybody who has the perspective that they know that they have the answer and they know, quote unquote, the truth is potentially a pretty narcissistic way of thinking. Do you know what I mean? Like
Totally.
with how much false media and false news and spin perspectives and complexity that there is, for anybody to claim that they have the answer to this is like thinking that they have access to all of those different complexities and perspectives and falsehoods. Do you know what I mean?
I do. In the past, I alluded to this earlier, and I'll just say it again, that I feel like in less heated, less polarized elections, I could actually sit with the tension between philosophy of conservatism, keeping things the same, smaller government, versus policies and plans and agendas of a more progressive point of view. And I've actually really enjoyed that process because I like thinking about these things. And the places I've landed have been all over the map as far as what political party I end up voting for. But it's come out of the kind of discourse and the kind of conversations and questioning and evaluation of things that are very hard to access when there's so much emotionality and polarization in the media. So it's tough to get somewhere productive there.
For sure. And for the person who's listening to this, if you have a partner or a friend or family member who has a very different view than you, and you really want to have the conversation with them, here's an invitation, is to do what you're saying, Will, is like really come from a place of curiosity and non-agenda listening. But I also think that coming from a place of vulnerability and starting from that place, including standing for the relationship. Hey, I really care about our relationship. I know we have different opinions here, but it's really important for me to get each other's worlds so that we can strengthen our relationship and not be divided by this. And if there's a place of vulnerability, like, hey, I'm scared. I am really, really, really scared. I'm scared about X. I'm scared about Y. I'm scared about Z. If we can have a conversation where we can include all the parts of us and all the perspectives and really come from a place of wanting to understand each other and support each other, I would love to do that. I would love to do that with you. Are you up for that? I think those elements are essential to have, at least try to start a conversation with somebody that you care about. They may not be able to meet those requirements, and that's okay. Then we probably need to be in a grief process about not being able to have that conversation with them. But let's start there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's wise. And I think, again, in a political environment where it feels like, to me, almost everyone I talk to is really scared, even if they don't admit it, it gets a lot harder for people to show up and be impacted by sharing vulnerability in a way that elicits a care response rather than, oh, you're scared? Well, I'm not scared. Like you're scared because you're putting your chips on the wrong candidate, or you're listening to the wrong media, or, it's like, right. It's tough. I mean, I don't disagree with you. I think it's a wonderful piece of advice to lead with that. And it brings up a great question of like, well, if the person's unable, if they don't have empathy for you sharing that vulnerability, then what's really going on there? And so out of care and protection for our listener, I would also suggest that if you don't get a caring response from sharing vulnerability, you get the hell out of there, or come back to the conversation when your family member or loved one can offer that to you. I think we all deserve that from each other, but it's super hard to give sometimes. It's not a character judgment. It's just, sometimes your own amygdala and, limbic system is out of control and can't show up for that.
Yeah. And a part of doing we really well is not forgetting the I and developing the I. And right. If there's a place where you feel like you can't be fully expressed inside of a partnership, responsibly expressed, and taking measures to make sure that you're taking responsibility for how you're expressed, there's a challenge there that might need to go back to the basics of like you said, well, like, are we up to in relationship? Why are we in relationship? What do we want here? And can we actually get that from this place? Well, this has not been an easy conversation. Again, we don't feel like we don't have the solutions, but we couldn't go without naming the impacts on relationship with the state of America right now.
Yeah. Thank you for having the difficult conversation and for bringing what I feel like is really good advice and, applying the values and the agreements that we have with each other, even more so in a really polarized and emotional moment.
For sure. And you just had me have an idea, which is the listener can take our top 10 agreements, which you can download from our website, KristaVanderveer.com, and you can go through those agreements and be like, okay, here are 3 or maybe 5 agreements that I want to bring into this conversation specifically.
Well, thank you for the conversation, and I hope everyone out there stays safe through this contentious moment.
Yeah. Thanks for listening. We'll be with you next week. Take care.